The sun was setting over Virginia's tree-lined highways as Agent Wilson made her way home from CIA headquarters. The beautiful orange and purple sky painted a peaceful scene that contrasted sharply with the weight of information she carried from today's classified briefing. Her mind was racing with thoughts about the upcoming mission, while her silver Audi glided smoothly along the familiar roads of her daily route. After 12 years as a CIA field operative, she had grown accustomed to compartmentalizing her thoughts. Today's briefing had revealed concerning developments in an ongoing investigation, but right now she was looking forward to a quiet evening at home with her cat and a good book. The gentle purr of her car's engine and the soft jazz playing on her premium sound system helped ease the tension from a long day of strategic planning. The clock on her dashboard read 7:45 p.m. when she noticed the flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. She checked her speed, 62 in a 65 zone, and signaled to pull over, guiding her car smoothly onto the shoulder of the road. As a federal agent, she'd had plenty of routine interactions with local law enforcement and expected this to be no different. Through her mirror, she watched Officer Brooks approach. Something about his walk, the aggressive way he held his flashlight, made her instincts tingle. In her years of fieldwork, she'd learned to read body language, and everything about his posture spelled trouble. Still, she remained professional, rolling down her window and placing both hands visibly on the steering wheel, standard procedure she'd followed countless times before. The beam of his flashlight swept across her face, then her car's interior, lingering longer than necessary. Officer Brooks had been with the county police department for 15 years, and his record was far from clean. Multiple complaints had been filed against him for racial profiling and aggressive behavior, but his department's Internal Affairs Division had repeatedly cleared him of wrongdoing. What he didn't know was that his next actions would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the entire department to its core. License and registration, he barked, his tone carrying none of the professional courtesy typically expected from law enforcement. Agent Wilson noticed he hadn't stated the reason for the stop. Another red flag that made her security training kick in. She maintained her calm demeanor while reaching slowly for her credentials. "Good evening, officer," she replied steadily, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that came from years of handling high-pressure situations. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" The streetlights cast harsh shadows across Officer Brooks's face as he scowled, his hand resting unnecessarily on his holster. "Your vehicle matches the description of one involved in a carjacking earlier today," he claimed, though no such report had been filed in the county's system. Agent Wilson's training allowed her to spot the lie immediately, but she kept her expression neutral. She knew this moment required delicate handling. One wrong move could escalate the situation dangerously. As an intelligence officer, she was well versed in diffusing tense situations, but something told her this encounter was about to test all of her professional skills. The cool evening air carried the sound of passing cars, each one representing potential witnesses to what was about to unfold. Agent Wilson took a slow, measured breath, preparing herself for what she sensed would be a challenging interaction. Her years of experience had taught her that sometimes the most dangerous situations weren't in foreign territories or high-stakes operations, but right here on American soil, where prejudice could turn a routine traffic stop into something far more serious. Little did Officer Brooks know that his next actions would not only change his career forever, but would also spark a nationwide conversation about law enforcement reform and racial bias in policing. The events about to unfold would serve as a powerful reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that justice, when properly pursued, knows no boundaries of badge or authority. Agent Wilson handed over her license and registration with practiced calm, her movements deliberate and smooth. The leather of her steering wheel felt cool under her steady hands as she watched Officer Brooks scrutinize her documents in the harsh beam of his flashlight. His frown deepened as he read her name and address, his eyes darting between the papers and her face with obvious suspicion. "Step out of the vehicle," he commanded, despite having no legitimate reason for the request. The wind had picked up, rustling through the trees that lined the highway, carrying with it the distant sound of traffic. Agent Wilson's training kicked in as she assessed the situation. This wasn't her first encounter with law enforcement bias, but something about Officer Brooks's demeanor suggested this one could be different. "Officer, I'd like to understand the reason for this request," she responded professionally, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had briefed cabinet members and managed international crises. "I've provided my documentation, and I'm not aware of any traffic violation I've committed." Officer Brooks's face hardened at her question. His hand tightened on his flashlight, knuckles whitening. "Ma'am, when I give you an order, I expect compliance, not questions. This vehicle matches the description of one used in a serious crime." Agent Wilson knew this was false. As a CIA operative, she had access to local police reports, and no such vehicle had been flagged. More concerning was the way Officer Brooks kept shifting his weight, his body language broadcasting aggression rather than professional concern. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job," she said, maintaining her composure while reaching slowly for her federal credentials in her jacket pocket. "I think it's important you know that I'm a federal agent. Hands where I can see them." Officer Brooks barked, his right hand moving to his weapon. The situation had escalated from questionable to dangerous in seconds. The passing cars slowed down, their headlights creating moving shadows across the scene. Some drivers were beginning to pull over, sensing something wasn't right. Agent Wilson froze, her hands returning to the steering wheel. Her mind raced through protocol and procedure. As a CIA operative, she was trained to handle hostile situations in foreign territories, but this was different. This was home, where her badge should have meant something. "Officer Brooks," she said, noting his nameplate for the first time, "I am reaching for my federal credentials. They're in my inside jacket pocket. I'm going to move very slowly." Her voice remained steady, though her heart was pounding. She'd faced down armed insurgents with less anxiety than she felt in this moment. But Officer Brooks wasn't listening. His bias had already written a narrative in his mind, one where an expensive car and a black woman couldn't add up to anything legitimate in his worldview. He'd made similar stops before, dozens of them, and his department had always backed him up. Internal affairs had cleared him so many times he'd stopped counting. "Exit the vehicle now, or I will remove you myself," he threatened, unclipping his holster. The dashcam in his patrol car recorded everything, though he'd forgotten about it in his escalating anger. Around them, more cars had stopped, and cell phones were emerging from windows. Modern technology meant this encounter wouldn't go undocumented. Agent Wilson weighed her options. Her CIA training included dozens of ways to disarm and subdue an attacker, but she knew using any of them would only make the situation worse. This wasn't a foreign operative she could neutralize. This was a police officer on American soil, and despite his clear misconduct, she had to handle this by the book. "I am going to open my door slowly," she announced clearly, her voice carrying to the growing audience of witnesses. "I want the record to show that I am complying under protest, and that I have identified myself as a federal agent." As she carefully opened her door, the interior light illuminated her professional attire, a tailored suit that spoke of government meetings and high-level clearance, not the profile Officer Brooks had convinced himself he was dealing with. But he was too far committed to his assumption to back down now. The growing crowd of onlookers created a peculiar backdrop to this scene, their headlights and phone cameras creating a makeshift stadium effect around the two main players in this drama. Some had begun recording, their devices capturing what would soon become viral evidence of law enforcement overreach. Agent Wilson stood slowly, her movements measured and non-threatening. The night air had grown colder, or perhaps it was the adrenaline making her more sensitive to the temperature. She knew the next few moments would be crucial. One wrong move, one misinterpreted gesture, and this situation could turn tragic. What Officer Brooks didn't realize was that his next actions would not only end his career, but would spark a nationwide conversation about police reform. The dashcam footage would be watched by millions, analyzed by experts, and used in training academies as an example of how bias can blind an officer to obvious facts. But for now, tension crackled in the air like static before a storm. Agent Wilson stood tall, her dignity intact despite the humiliation of the situation. She had faced down dictators and terrorists, but somehow this encounter on a quiet Virginia highway felt more dangerous than any overseas mission. The next few moments would prove just how right that feeling was. Standing in the cold Virginia night, Agent Wilson felt the weight of years of training settle over her like armor. The growing crowd of onlookers had created an unexpected safety net, Dozens of phone cameras now captured every moment of this encounter. Their presence might have made Officer Brooks more cautious, but instead, it seemed to fuel his determination. "Hands against the vehicle," he ordered, his voice carrying a hint of satisfaction that made her stomach turn. She complied, knowing that every move she made needed to be textbook perfect. The cold metal of her car pressed against her palms as she spread her fingers wide, making it clear she held nothing threatening. A quick glance at the side mirror showed more cars pulling over. Some drivers had stepped out of their vehicles, their faces illuminated by the blue and red lights still flashing from Officer Brooks's patrol car. Among them, she noticed a man in a delivery uniform quietly speaking into his phone, likely calling 911. Good. Outside intervention might be exactly what this situation needed. "Officer," she tried one more time, her voice clear and steady, "my federal credentials are in my left inside pocket. If you'll allow me to—" I said quiet. Officer Brooks snapped, moving closer. "I've heard every excuse in the book. You expect me to believe someone like you is a federal agent?" The bias in his words hung heavy in the air, making several onlookers gasp audibly. Agent Wilson felt a familiar calm settle over her, the same stillness she'd experienced in high-stakes operations overseas. She'd faced armed militants with less hostility than this officer was showing. As a CIA operative, she was trained to read people, to understand their motivations and predict their actions. Everything about Officer Brooks's behavior suggested he was looking for an excuse to escalate. The sound of distant sirens cut through the tension. Someone in the growing crowd murmured, "Thank God." Officer Brooks seemed not to notice, too focused on his perceived authority over the situation. He moved closer, his breath visible in the cold air. "You're going to learn about respect for law enforcement tonight," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. The words sent a chill down her spine, not from fear, but from recognition. How many others had he said similar things to? How many times had this scene played out without witnesses? As he reached for his handcuffs, Agent Wilson made a decision. Her hand moved slowly, deliberately toward her pocket. "Officer Brooks, I am informing you one final time that I am reaching for my federal credentials. Your body camera is recording this, and I want the record to show." "Gun." Officer Brooks shouted, though she'd made no threatening movement. Several people in the crowd called out in protest, their phones still recording. She's reaching for a weapon. The next few moments seemed to unfold in slow motion. Agent Wilson's CIA training screamed at her to react, to neutralize the threat, but she forced herself to remain still. Any defensive movement now would only justify his aggression. Instead, she slowly pulled out her credentials, the gold badge catching the flashing lights. "This is my federal identification," she said loudly, making sure the crowd and any cameras could pick up her words. "I am exercising my right to identify myself as a federal agent. I am not resisting, and I am not armed." Officer Brooks froze for a split second, his hands still on his weapon. The crowd had grown silent, the only sounds being the approaching sirens and the soft whir of phone cameras. This was his moment to step back, to reassess, to handle the situation professionally. Instead, he knocked the credentials from her hand, sending them skittering across the pavement. The crowd's reaction was immediate. Shocked gasps and angry murmurs rippled through the gathered witnesses. Someone shouted, "I got that on video." Another voice called out, "Badge number 6783, we saw everything." Agent Wilson remained still, her hands back against the vehicle. She'd activated her emergency beacon, a small device all CIA field operatives carried, the moment Officer Brooks had escalated the situation. Help was already on the way, but the next few minutes would be crucial. The approaching sirens grew louder, now accompanied by the distinctive sound of multiple vehicles. Officer Brooks seemed to realize he'd crossed a line, but pride or prejudice prevented him from backing down. He roughly grabbed her wrist, the handcuffs appearing in his other hand. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer and making threatening movements," he declared, loud enough for his body camera to pick up. The absurdity of the charges would be clear to anyone watching the footage later, but in this moment he was still operating under the authority of his badge. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Agent Wilson noticed something that Officer Brooks, in his tunnel vision, had missed, the unmarked federal vehicles now pulling up behind the crowd of witnesses. His night was about to take an unexpected turn, and the consequences of his actions were about to become very real. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Agent Wilson's wrists as Officer Brooks roughly guided her toward his patrol car. The crowd of witnesses had grown larger, their phones still recording every moment of this unfolding drama. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, but these weren't the typical wail of police sirens. These engines had a different, more powerful rumble. "You're making a huge mistake," Agent Wilson said calmly, her voice carrying across the now hushed audience. "Those are federal vehicles approaching, and this situation is about to change dramatically." She kept her voice steady, professional, even as Officer Brooks pushed her toward the back seat of his patrol car. The gathered crowd parted as 3 black SUVs pulled up, their tinted windows reflecting the flashing lights of the police cruiser. Officer Brooks faltered for a moment, his grip on Agent Wilson's arm loosening slightly as he watched the vehicles surround his patrol car in a practiced maneuver. The doors of the SUVs opened simultaneously, and out stepped 6 individuals in dark suits, their movements precise and coordinated. Their badges gleamed in the streetlights, but these weren't local law enforcement or even FBI. These were CIA tactical response team members specifically trained for situations where their agents were compromised. Officer Brooks called out a commanding voice from the lead SUV. A distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit emerged, his presence immediately commanding attention. "I'm the Assistant Director of Operations for the Central Intelligence Agency. Release our agent immediately." The blood drained from Officer Brooks's face as the reality of his situation began to sink in. The crowd watched in silent fascination as more federal agents emerged from the vehicles, their expressions stern and professional. Among the onlookers, phones continued recording what had turned from a case of police misconduct into something far more significant. She was reaching for something," Officer Brooks stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating. "She made threatening movements." "Everything is on camera, officer," one of the suited agents cut in, pointing to the multiple phones in the crowd, the dash cam, and Brooks's own body camera. "Every single second." The assistant director approached, his shoes crunching on the gravel shoulder of the road. "Remove those handcuffs immediately," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And then you'll explain to me why one of our most valuable agents was treated like a common criminal despite properly identifying herself." Officer Brooks fumbled with the handcuff keys, his hands shaking slightly as he released Agent Wilson. She remained composed, rubbing her wrists slightly as she was freed. One of the federal agents quickly retrieved her credentials from where they had fallen on the pavement, respectfully returning them to her. The crowd of witnesses murmured as they watched the power dynamic shift dramatically. Several people were still recording, capturing the moment when Officer Brooks's authority crumbled in the face of federal intervention. Some had already started uploading their videos to social media, ensuring that this incident wouldn't be quietly swept under the rug like so many before it. "Your body camera footage, your dashcam recording, and your service weapon will all be collected as evidence," the assistant director continued, gesturing to his team. 2 agents approached Officer Brooks, their movements precise and professional. "We'll also need your badge and any other department-issued equipment." Officer Brooks stood frozen, watching as his career imploded around him. The years of unchecked bias, the complaints that had been ignored, the superior officers who had looked the other way, none of them could help him now. This wasn't a situation that could be explained away with a simple report or dismissed by an understanding supervisor. Agent Wilson watched the scene unfold with mixed emotions. As a law enforcement professional herself, she took no pleasure in seeing another officer's career end. But as someone who had faced discrimination throughout her life, she understood the importance of this moment. Sometimes change only came through difficult circumstances and hard lessons. The crowd began to disperse as federal agents took control of the scene, collecting statements from witnesses and gathering contact information from those who had recorded videos. Local police sirens could be heard in the distance, backup that Officer Brooks had called for earlier, arriving too late to save his career. "Agent Wilson," the assistant director addressed her professionally, "will need your full statement for the record. This incident will be thoroughly investigated at multiple levels." His tone carried both respect for her position and barely contained anger at how she had been treated. As she stood there, now surrounded by fellow federal agents instead of hostile local law enforcement, Agent Wilson thought about all the others who had faced similar situations without the protection of a federal badge. Her training, her position, and her quick thinking had turned this incident from a potential tragedy into a moment of accountability. But she knew her work wasn't finished. This would become a catalyst for change, a clear example of why reform and accountability was so desperately needed. The night air had grown colder, but the heat of the moment had faded into something more profound. As Agent Wilson prepared to give her statement, she looked at the dispersing crowd, the shocked Officer Brooks, and her fellow federal agents. This wasn't just about one traffic stop gone wrong. It was about systemic issues that needed to be addressed. And perhaps, just perhaps, this incident would help push that change forward. The next morning, the police station buzzed with unprecedented activity. News vans lined the street outside, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical flowers. Inside, the chief of police sat at his desk, his face drawn with concern as he reviewed the videos that had gone viral overnight. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since 5 a.m. The footage was damning. Multiple angles from bystanders' phones showed the entire incident in crystal clear detail. The dashcam and body camera footage, which tech specialists had already retrieved, painted an even clearer picture. On his computer screen, the chief watched Officer Brooks ignore Agent Wilson's attempts to identify herself, saw him escalate a routine traffic stop into a civil rights violation. Down the hall, in the department's largest conference room, federal agents had set up a temporary command center. They worked with military precision, interviewing officers, reviewing records, and piecing together a pattern that should have been noticed years ago. The assistant director stood at the head of the table, coordinating with various agency heads via video conference. "We've uncovered 67 similar stops in the past 18 months alone," a federal analyst reported, spreading documents across the table. All targeting minorities, all with increasingly aggressive behavior from Officer Brooks. She placed photographs showing a clear pattern of escalating incidents, each one a missed opportunity for intervention. The department's internal affairs officers sat in uncomfortable silence, their own files spread before them. They dismissed complaint after complaint, marking them unfounded or insufficient evidence. Now, with federal investigators coming through every detail, those decisions would face intense scrutiny. Outside, the media circus grew larger. Local reporters who had ignored similar stories in the past now clamored for details about the CIA agent wrongfully arrested by a biased officer. National news networks had picked up the story, their coverage focusing on the broader implications for police reform and accountability. Social media exploded with the viral videos. Hashtags trended as millions shared and commented on the footage. Civil rights organizations issued statements, and police reform advocates pointed to the incident as a perfect example of why change was needed. The videos had been viewed over 10 million times in just a few hours. Back at CIA headquarters, Agent Wilson sat in a secure conference room, giving her official statement. Her words were measured and precise, focused on facts rather than emotions. As she spoke, high-ranking officials listened intently, understanding that this incident would have far-reaching consequences for law enforcement relationships across the country. "I want to be clear," she said, her voice steady, "this isn't just about one officer or one traffic stop. This is about a system that allowed this behavior to continue unchecked until it happened to someone with a federal badge." Her words carried the weight of years of similar experiences, both personal and professional. The assistant director nodded, making notes as she spoke. On the wall-mounted screens, video feeds showed similar meetings happening at the Department of Justice and FBI headquarters. This had become more than an isolated incident, it was now a catalyst for change. Meanwhile, at his home, Officer Brooks sat in stunned silence. His phone lay on the coffee table, buzzing constantly with messages from fellow officers, none of them supportive. His union representative had already called to explain that while they would provide him with legal counsel, his actions were indefensible. His 20-year career had imploded in a single traffic stop. The police chief called an emergency press conference for that afternoon. As his staff prepared statements and gathered data, he knew this would be the most important speech of his career. This wasn't just about addressing one incident, it was about acknowledging systemic problems and committing to real change. In the conference room next door, federal investigators continued their work. They'd discovered that Officer Brooks's personnel file contained multiple red flags that had been ignored. Training officers had noted his aggressive tendencies, fellow officers had reported concerning behavior, and civilian complaints had piled up. Each overlooked warning had contributed to this moment. Agent Wilson's case file grew thicker by the hour. Witness statements poured in, each one corroborating her account and adding new details. The delivery driver who had called 911, the college student who had captured the clearest video, the off-duty nurse who had stopped to help, their testimonies created an airtight case. Local community leaders began organizing a town hall meeting to discuss police reform. The incident had opened a door for meaningful dialogue about law enforcement practices and accountability. Civil rights attorneys prepared documentation for what would become a landmark case in police reform. As the day progressed, the story continued to gain national attention. News analysts discussed the broader implications, reform advocates cited statistics, and law enforcement officials across the country watched closely, knowing this case would set new precedents for accountability and oversight. The incident had become a turning point, transforming a moment of injustice into an opportunity for meaningful change. Agent Wilson's professional handling of the situation, combined with the undeniable evidence and swift federal response, had created the perfect storm for reform. Sometimes it took a dramatic incident to shine a light on long-standing problems and finally force the system to address them. 2 weeks after the incident, the Department of Justice launched a full-scale investigation into the police department's practices. The modern glass building that housed the DOJ's Civil Rights Division buzzed with activity as investigators pored over decades of records, comparing incident reports, civilian complaints, and internal reviews. The conference room walls were covered with timeline charts and data analysis. One investigator stood back, coffee cup in hand, studying a particularly telling graph. "Look at this pattern," she said to her colleague. Traffic stops targeting minorities increased by 300% in certain neighborhoods over the past 5 years, but not a single complaint was upheld by internal affairs. Meanwhile, across town, the police department underwent a dramatic transformation. The chief of police, now under intense public scrutiny, had brought in independent consultants to completely overhaul their training and oversight procedures. The same hallways that once echoed with silence about misconduct now rang with discussions of reform and accountability. "Every officer will undergo new bias training," the chief announced during a department-wide meeting. The usually rowdy briefing room sat in attentive silence. "And we're implementing a new oversight committee that includes civilian representatives from every community we serve." Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in agreement, understanding that change was not just inevitable but necessary. At the state capitol, legislators worked late into the night, drafting new laws for police accountability. The incident had sparked a nationwide conversation, and state representatives felt the pressure to act. The normally slow-moving wheels of legislation had found new speed, pushed by public demand and media attention. "We can't wait for the next incident," one senator argued during a heated session. "We need concrete changes now." The bills they were crafting would require body cameras to be active during all encounters, establish civilian review boards with real power, and create strict guidelines for traffic stops. The story had taken on a life of its own in the media. News channels ran special reports examining similar incidents across the country. Expert panels discussed the broader implications for law enforcement reform. But unlike previous stories that faded after a few news cycles, this one stayed in the spotlight, partly due to the irrefutable evidence and the unique circumstances of a CIA agent being the target. In community centers and church basements across the city, people gathered to share their own stories. The incident had opened a floodgate of similar experiences, but now these stories were being heard with new ears. Local leaders worked with police representatives to establish better communication channels and build trust. At CIA headquarters, Agent Wilson's experience had sparked internal discussions about the agency's role in domestic law enforcement reform. The assistant director had initiated new protocols for interagency cooperation and training programs to help local police departments better understand federal law enforcement. "Your handling of the situation was exemplary," the assistant director told Agent Wilson during a briefing. "But it also highlighted a serious problem in law enforcement that we can't ignore." The incident was already being incorporated into training materials for both federal agents and local police departments. The town hall meetings grew larger each week. People from all walks of life came together to discuss solutions and share perspectives. In one particularly moving session, a retired police officer stood up to speak about the culture he'd witnessed during his career and the changes he wished he'd pushed for harder. Social media continued to play a crucial role in maintaining momentum for reform. The original videos had spawned thousands of discussions, debates, and calls for action. Hashtags evolved from simply sharing the incident to organizing community actions and tracking progress on reforms. Former Officer Brooks's case moved through the justice system, serving as a warning to other officers who might abuse their authority. His body camera footage became a training tool, showing future officers exactly what not to do and how unconscious bias could escalate situations unnecessarily. The police union, initially defensive, began to shift its stance. "We need to be part of the solution," the union president stated in a press release. "Protecting our officers means ensuring they're properly trained and held accountable when they fail to meet our standards." Independent oversight committees were established, giving civilian representatives real power to review police conduct. The committees included members from various communities, ensuring diverse perspectives in evaluating police actions and policies. Technology companies developed new software to flag problematic patterns in police behavior before they escalated to serious incidents. The system would track everything from the language used in traffic stops to the demographics of those being pulled over, creating early warning signs of potential bias. As weeks turned into months, the changes began to show real results. Traffic stop statistics showed more equitable treatment across all demographics. Civilian complaints were investigated thoroughly, and community satisfaction with police interactions improved steadily. The incident had become a case study in how a single moment, properly documented and responded to, could spark genuine systematic change. It proved that accountability wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It was about creating a system that prevented it from happening in the first place. 6 months after the incident, Agent Wilson stood at a podium in the Capitol building. The marble halls that had seen centuries of American history now witnessed another moment of change. Before her sat members of Congress, civil rights leaders, law enforcement officials, and community organizers, all gathered for a special hearing on police reform. "What happened to me that night wasn't unique," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "What was unique was my position and the evidence that couldn't be ignored." The room sat in respectful silence as she shared not just her story, but the stories of countless others who had faced similar situations without the protection of a federal badge. In the audience, the former police chief nodded solemnly. After the incident, he had chosen to retire early, but not before implementing sweeping changes in his department. His successor, a reform-minded officer with a strong community connection, sat beside him, taking notes for further improvements. The changes that had started in one police department had spread across the country like ripples in a pond. Police academies revised their training programs, incorporating lessons learned from the incident. New recruits now spent more time learning about bias recognition and community relations than ever before. "Real change comes from understanding," Agent Wilson continued, gesturing to the thick binder of statistics before her. "In departments that have implemented these new training programs, we've seen a 70% reduction in complaint rates. Community trust has improved by measurable margins." The hearing room screens displayed graphs and charts showing the impact of the reforms. Body camera footage now uploaded automatically to secure servers, preventing tampering. Civilian oversight boards had real power to investigate complaints. Traffic stop data was publicly accessible, ensuring transparency and accountability. In the back of the room sat some of the witnesses from that night. The delivery driver who had called 911 had become an active member of his local police oversight committee. The college student whose video had gone viral now taught community workshops on knowing your rights during police encounters. This isn't about targeting police officers, Agent Wilson emphasized, addressing the concerns of law enforcement representatives. It's about protecting both officers and civilians by creating clear guidelines, proper training, and real accountability. Several police chiefs in attendance nodded in agreement, their own departments already seeing the benefits of the new approaches. The technology sector had stepped up as well. New apps helped citizens record and safely store encounters with law enforcement. Police departments adopted software that flagged problematic patterns before they became serious incidents. Even social media platforms had created special tools for organizing community safety initiatives. Former Officer Brooks's case had concluded months ago. His sentencing included not just punishment but rehabilitation, mandatory training in bias recognition, and community service working with minority youth programs. His story became a cautionary tale in police academies nationwide, showing how unchecked bias could destroy both careers and public trust. The changes weren't limited to law enforcement. Communities had started programs bringing officers and residents together in non-enforcement situations. Local businesses sponsored events where police could meet community members as neighbors rather than authority figures. Schools invited officers to participate in discussions about bias and community relations. The incident that brought me here today could have ended very differently, Agent Wilson said, approaching her conclusion. But instead of becoming another tragedy, it became a catalyst for change. She paused, looking around the room. Now it's our responsibility to ensure these changes last. The legislative package being discussed that day would make many of the successful local reforms into national standards. Body cameras would be mandatory. Regular bias training would be required for all officers. Civilian oversight boards would have real investigative power. Traffic stop data would be reviewed quarterly for signs of profiling. In the gallery, community activists who had fought for these changes for years watched with cautious optimism. They knew that laws alone couldn't solve everything, but this was a significant step forward. The incident had opened doors that had previously been firmly closed. Agent Wilson concluded her testimony by addressing the future. These reforms aren't just about preventing another incident like mine. They're about building a justice system that truly serves and protects everyone equally. The room erupted in applause, Democrats and Republicans alike standing in support. As she left the podium, Agent Wilson thought about that night on the highway. One moment of injustice, captured on camera and impossible to ignore, had sparked a movement for real change. The system hadn't fixed itself overnight, but steady progress was being made, one policy change, one training session, one community meeting at a time. Outside the Capitol, reporters gathered for statements from various officials. But the real story wasn't in the sound bites or headlines. It was in police departments across the country, where officers started their shifts with better training and clearer guidelines. It was in communities where residents felt more confident in their interactions with law enforcement. It was in the countless small changes that added up to significant reform. The incident had shown that change was possible when people were willing to confront uncomfortable truths and work together for solutions. As Agent Wilson's driver took her back to CIA headquarters, she smiled, knowing that her experience had helped create a safer, more just system for everyone.